Okay, so last session we looked a little bit at description and just looking at things, and I have a breakdown for this. I might drag up the image that we were looking at. Let me just bring that up here, share. So this is the image. I'm going to try and get rid of the clutter so we can look at it properly. So this is the image, ignoring my image in the corner. I might try and reduce that, maybe. Yes, okay. So the exercise in the workshop was to, what do you literally see? What can you describe without interpretation? What words keep recurring in your descriptions? Which descriptions are observations and which are assumptions? So we assume a lot. I think this is really key. The last statement here. Which descriptions are observations and which are assumptions? This is central. Now, I love misreadings. I love misrecognitions. And we don't, a lot of the time, get to correct those misreadings or misrecognitions as our critics or art writers, whatever you want to call yourself. But we have the facility, we have the freedom to correct those things. I remember a moment when, I think it was during Dublin Contemporary, which happened in 2011, and there was this artwork, and someone from Art Forum or whatever, Freeze or Art Monthly, came in, and there was a palette on the floor, and they started to talk about ready-mades and Duchamp and all this history around the ready-made in the review of the work. But they had misread or misrecognized the palette as a real palette, as a ready-made palette, when in fact it was a cast of a palette. So it's something that came up recently in the workshop that I've been referencing around exhibiting by an artist, and he started to talk about distillation. Distilling all the process into this one object. And I thought it was a beautiful insight, because that's what we do as artists. We distill all process into this one moment. And I think that's something we don't acknowledge enough. Distillation. And then we hope the artwork kind of holds all this process in some way. And we're always disappointed in the reception to an artwork because people don't pick up on the distillation. Where the source of this artwork? How did it end up here? And we lose that. We lose all of that background noise when we experience an artwork. But what writing does, it allows you to try and explore the distillation. And it's the same with this work here. And misrecognition is part of that. But if we look closely enough, if we start to describe an image, just in terms of color, tone, texture, light, we can get a lot from this image. We can talk about the oxblood leather of the armchair, which the older man is sitting in. We can talk about the rusty, or kind of, is it a cardinal red? No, it's not. It's kind of a a dusty red, rusty kind of red skirt the girl is wearing. We can talk about this kind of viridian green trough that is discarded on the floor. We can talk about the bin in the background behind the oxblood, this kind of beautiful complementary with the oxblood. We can talk about the drinks on the table. We can talk about the Monopoly board game underneath that other table with the lamp. We can talk about the lamp being lit on the left hand side and the other lamp to the right, which is turned off. We can talk about the VHS videos on the floor, which brings in a kind of anachronism. Is this from the 1980s or 90s? Or is it just a basement space in which all these objects from the past are stored? They seem very comfortable here. But we're just trying to describe. We can look at the paintings on the walls, the paneling on the walls. We can look at that doorway, which perhaps it isn't a basement. It looks like a basement, but there's a doorway and it looks like daylight is filtering through. We can look at the birds and the deer in the images that are hung on the panel wall. We can describe the different furniture. It's not mid-century modern. It's the legs are kind of splayed on the tables. They're watching something, or maybe not watching something. Maybe it's a television in that cabinet that we can't see. The glow of it is there. There's a kind of daylight glow off the TV. We can talk about the dress code of the two individuals and the relationship, the spatial relationship between them. One highly covered up, the older man, the other more half-dressed, a lot of flesh on show. We can talk about the postures. We can talk about the texture of the couch versus the oxblood. We can talk about the carpet. And as a whole, we can talk about the atmosphere. But we're just describing this, and through description, we can kind of grind out analysis. Of course, intention comes into play, and this is not just a snapshot of reality. It seems very staged. We haven't asked the question, is it a photograph or is it a painting? We might assume, keeping in mind which descriptions are observations and which are assumptions, that there's a difference between a description and an assumption or a speculation. So we assume that it's a photograph. It has that quality, but it also has a painted quality. And it seems like, not just in terms of surface or the tonal quality, but the staging seems painted. That why would you put in this amount of attention to this arbitrary scene if it wasn't a painting? If it wasn't deserving of a painting? Is it deserving of being painted? Or is it just merely a photograph? And why would you put so much effort into staging for a photograph? So there's a kind of, when you start to describe the thing, you start to get this conflict or tension between representation as photograph and representation as painting. There's a lot of color coding going on in this image. There's a lot of deliberation, but there's a lot of intention. It's very theatrical without the drama. It has a low-level theatre. And when we start to meditate on this image, we start to think about relationships. And of course, when we look at an image like this, a very Lynchian Americana image, we start to think about relationships. We start to think about the psychology of space. We start to think about how people react or relate to each other in a space. Especially, let's assume, a familial space. It's not a pretty picture, it's a picture that we may just ignore in real life unless we're put in a situation like a workshop to look at it for 5 minutes. The skin tone of the girl. The haggard face of the older man. He seems cold. She seems warm. They're together but not. We can go through the cliches. We can go through all those cliches, familial relationships, mother-daughter relationships, we're assuming. We can look at that window in the top corner, just below the ceiling. It feels prison-like. There's an uncanny quality to this image. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I didn't mean to do three of these sessions in a row, but I'm going to show you a second image, which is a very different image. And I did this on the day of the workshop also. It was an image that ended up in my inbox. I'm a subscriber to this art publishing house in Paris. And I've bought some of their publications. That's another thing, like, you know, you have to go elsewhere, I feel, even though with the launch of Paper Visual, which I have no desire to get my hands on. I've only desire for things that are elsewhere, like in Paris or New York. I was in Printed Matter in New York only a few months ago, and I could have stayed there for a week just researching. Picked up a few zines by artists that I recognized from currently, but also from the past. And I have a desire for books, but there's nowhere at the moment in Ireland that seduces me as a book lover, as a zine lover, as an artist zine lover. That's why I'm here printing my own. So I'm going to show you the second image. So this is a second image, and I'll track back to the previous image and talk about the biographical information around the artist and his intentions in relation to that image. But this is a second image by an artist. I didn't know the artist until I received the email. Now I do. Now I desire the book that is coming out later in the year. But this is one of 2 prints that are for sale. Editioned prints. And this is the more abstract of the 2. So you can make lots of assumptions about this image. It's always better to have an audience looking at images together, because everyone can kind of assume or describe in different ways. But this image, well, I'll let you have a look for a minute. And what can you get from this image in terms of description? It's difficult to describe. We can assume a lot about this image. The textures, the skin, the clothing, the rope. The framing around it, that white frame, looks very Instagram or Polaroid, a la Kimoan Mitrawa, which we discussed earlier, the Native American artist. It was a beautiful image. It was an image that seduced me when I saw it, and it pulled me into this kind of rabbit hole, as we all do, into looking up this artist and seeing more of what they do. Well, we can describe it. It's black and white. It's a photograph. Are these wrists? Are these legs? Arms? Is that a suede jacket? Is it one person? Is there a second person in the background? Is it an elbow? Has it been flipped in some way? What is the knot that ties it all together? It seems monstrous when you think about it, but it's also beautiful. It seems voyeuristic. But if we describe it that these are hairless limbs, let's call them. They've been shaved, have they? Are there goosebumps on their, I don't know, I think you can get a sense that maybe with the light, that bright shadow, that there's a sun somewhere outside of the crop of the image that is quite bright. So there's a correspondent negative and positive reflection in the knot between shadow and the rope. It doubles up as a shadow. The rope is white in this black and white photograph. On the day I presented this, one of the audience members described it as, is it a Chinese or Japanese sex knot, which is easily unknotted, released. That when you have that description, you have that provenance, then things shift, don't, in your head. All of a sudden you're naming something that has a certain provenance, a certain culture, a certain purpose. So it becomes quite erotically charged. When erotics is brought up, I always think of the Susan Sontag line from her essay from 1966, Against Interpretation, which she ends with this. I think, I'm paraphrasing maybe a little bit because I don't have it at hand, but she says something like, instead of a hermeneutics of art, we need an erotics of art. So here we've been talking about language theory and hermeneutics, which can be sourced back to biblical times, and the interpretation of the Gospels, etc. in that context. Hermeneutics is a kind of interpretation. And Sontag places, like we did with respect to subjectivity and objectivity, Sontag places hermeneutics in opposition to erotics, which she wants an erotics rather than a hermeneutics, which involves the intellect, involves language. And I always get from that essay, and I'm a massive fan of Susan Sontag. She is one of the reasons why I write. critically, because she was a critic. She always took this dissenting position, especially as a female writer, a female critic, up against people like Norman Mailer. And speaking of Gore Vidal, which I brought up earlier, he was definitely against Norman Mailer in their interactions. But this idea of erotics, I always get from Susan Sontag that as a giant in terms of intellectual capacity, I think that Against Interpretation is a very biographical, very personal essay on Sontag's own difficulty of not bringing the intellect into a discussion around art, which she does in the actual essay. Now, it's a cheap shot to say that about that essay. A kind of gotcha moment in that, yeah, of course she's interpreting against interpretation. But I find it just a deeply personal effort to exercise that word again, the intellect. Sorry, I got a phone call. So, yeah, I think that, yeah, she was trying to exercise the intellect, to experience art on a sensory level, that you could get lost in the experience of art. But I digress. This image here, if you describe it, you get closer and closer. But also, erotics for me has a kind of ambiguity and ambivalence. That's what makes it erotically charged. And looking at this image and going beyond this image after first receiving it as an email, not as a real thing in the world, but as an email, is also erotically charged. That it teases with its intentions, its expressions, and its form overrides its content in a weird way, because I always feel that we digest images immediately and then we start to process them. But on seeing this immediately, I was immediately seduced by its ambiguity, its eroticism, its the way in which it destables or disorientates in terms of language and description. I haven't discovered any more about this image since, but I do love it as an image. I don't have the money to buy the image, but perhaps I don't want it either. It's the lure, it's the enticement of the image that has enough. The artist that made this image is a photographer. She is engaged in analog photography. She works, I think, exclusively in the darkroom. And there is that sensuality in the work, this erotics that Sontag was talking about, that uncannily, in Freud's terminology, disorientates the intellect. So, I'm going to go back to this image and just talk a little bit about this in relation to biographical content, and which will hopefully broach this thing that we called analysis. So I'm gonna open my little image thing here. Yeah, okay. So This image, this photograph, and it is a photograph, is by Gregory Crewdson, who is an artist, and I think he could be represented by the Gagosian or one of those mega galleries. And he's also a Yale professor of photography. He has a very big reputation in America, and he makes images that are very Lynchian. He even talks about being influenced by David Lynch. So when we have the context, he's American. He has this lineage between Lynch and himself. You get this filmic context for his work. A lot of the descriptors of this work is that it feels like a film still, that it's something plucked from a greater narrative. And that's interesting, because when we are given the whole narrative, somehow the eroticism is exercised. I'm going to use that. Maybe we should call this series of sessions something to do with exorcism. The conditions of exorcism. Or, I don't know. Let's think about it anyway. So when you get to know more about Gregory Crewdson, which I have over the years, and I've looked a lot of his images, they usually involve people in spaces, in a kind of landscape orientation. And there's a kind of melancholia or tragedy, something that, a kind of traumatic kernel beneath the images. They have that atmosphere, that tone. The same way Lynch does in a weird way. There's always something underneath. The way Crewdson goes about producing works like this is he brings a film crew, and he sets up like a film crew would to take a still image. He obsesses about times of day, props, the lighting conditions, the atmosphere. There's always a dishevelment in the work, but it's always performative as well. The thrown off the sofa, for instance. One light turned off, one light turned on. It's almost verging on cliche. And then you can talk, when you bring up that word cliche, you can talk about artists like John Kern, who embraced and wanted to exaggerate the idea of cliche. D.H. Lawrence has an essay, I think it's D.H. Lawrence has an essay on cliche, and especially American artists' use of the cliche as a new country. So cliche is important, readability is important, but also ambiguity, an uncanny sense of disorientation in relation to the geography of the image, the topography, how people are located in space, their relationship with each other and the space. All this stuff is going on. The drinks are important as well. The detachment is important as well. When you dig deeper into Crewdson's biography, he reveals in one interview that I've read that his father was a psychoanalyst, and he held his sessions downstairs in a basement. And Crewdson, as a child, used to sit on the stairs listening into these conversations his father had with his clients. As a child, of course, He couldn't understand a lot of what was being said because he hadn't that verbal capacity. But it also, he couldn't hear everything because of the wall, the division between what has been said downstairs and what was being heard through the wall on the stairs. So there's a lot of misreading and misrecognition going on here. And that's what makes this beautiful. That the provenance, the motivation, the psychological motivation of Crewdson's work begins in a moment in childhood that has to do with storytelling, gaps in storytelling, what Hal Foster calls the missing parts of art. I love that because in a weird way it explains it all, but we're still left with these images that don't explain it all. And they're seductive or erotic for that very reason. But that doesn't mean they're subjective. That doesn't mean that the viewer brings their own baggage to the work. We can bring a lot of our own curiosity, of course, our own baggage, but by looking intently at something, we can make our descriptions analytic, critical, whatever. But we can broaden the repertoire around an image easily. So that is analysis. I think I'll stop there. I'm going to stop my So in a way, description is a way of getting into an image. That's all it is. It's a way of entering. And then through our descriptions, we can gain insight in terms of where we locate the image, whether it's abstraction or representation. Gregory Crewdson, or I think it's Danielle New, is the artist who made the photograph. I'll put it in the notes anyway, because I didn't know of her beforehand, but I really love her photography. And I'm dealing with photographs here, not paintings, even though the Daniel New photograph is very abstract, and it lends itself to lots of misreadings. So yeah, descriptions, a good exercise is to try and just describe as many things as you can in an image, like the Gregory Crewdson or the Daniel New, and see where that gets you. And then out of that, analysis comes in. And that's your reading around it. Like I had to read a lot around Crewdson's work to get to that point where I'm looking into his own biography as a child. And he allows that out there. A lot of artists don't. And that's a question, isn't it? It's a question, should artists reveal their biography, where the work comes from? A lot of artists aren't aware of that either. They're not psychologically minded. They do not want to reflect on where their art comes from. And then you have to ask the question, is it a good thing to be aware? For some artists it is, for some artists it isn't. I think most artists do disavow. They understand the makeup of themselves psychologically, socially, all that stuff. But to survive, to make work, they have to disavow a lot of it. I'll give you a good one to end with, and that is my own story, which I've told sometimes, or maybe a few times in essays I've written. But when I was a teenager, a young teenager, 13, 14, the same age as my son now, my mother passed. And in the preceding years, or succeeding years, I started to become obsessed with Raphael, the Renaissance painter. Not Leonardo or not Michelangelo, but Raphael. And I became especially obsessed with his Madonna and Child. And I didn't connect the death of my mother with this new obsession, this fetishistic disavowal in Freudian language. And only in adulthood can I reflect back on it and analyze it in a way. But I was describing something through a series of paintings I started to make based on Raphael's articulation of that trope, the Madonna and Child. My articulations were a little bit stranger though, in that as someone living in Ireland in the countryside as a teenager, I started to use myself as a model first of all, for both Child and Madonna. So using the mirror, painting in a mirror, and both renditions of the Mother and Child were naked. They weren't draped in clothing, even though ultramarine was picked up in the skies or something around them, not in the drapery. And I did a series of these and became obsessed with depicting this particular religious trope, not knowing why I was doing it, not being able to self-analyze. But I had found a way to describe what I was feeling without actually facing up to it. And that weirdly was the day I became an artist, because I became really productive. I drew every day, painted every day. I exhausted this trope. I even used some of my paintings of the Madonna and Child to get into delirium. I was painting them all the way up for years, not realizing why I was doing it. And like Crutzen, I could locate that was the moment I became an artist. And we're all doing that as artists. We're all doing exorcisms in terms of how we describe the world through the mediums in which we have adopted, whether it's painting, sculpture, film, photography, whatever. We're all doing it, and it's coming from somewhere. And I don't believe Liam Gillick. Liam Gillick divides the art world into objective artists and subjective artists, but I think there's only subjectivity. And that's not, I hate that word in relation to opinion and criticism. Subjectivity is a kind of being enraptured by your subjecthood and not being able to escape it. Some people call it navel gazing, whatever. But subjectivity is something very powerful. It's one of the books, The New Subjectivism by Donald Cuspit, who also is psychoanalytically leaning. When I first fell in love with essays on art, critical essays on art. So even though we have become a culture of individuals, of individual artists and their branding, I think individuality versus community or collectivity or collaboration is where things really happen in the arts. I think everything is, using that term, distillation. I think that distillation can't happen when you're collaborating with other artists, but I definitely think it can happen in a very potent way when you're distilling yourself, whether that is your histories, your biography, or your present context, into a work of art. Okay, I'll leave this analysis done. Next is the fun thing of critique. And yeah, I don't know how I'm going to approach that. It's always difficult to talk about criticism because it can become kind of boring. But what I would say is, as a preface, it's very much about an awareness of the outside world. It's what Liam Gillick is engaged in. That's what makes him a great critic. Especially his critics of Claire Bishop and her critique of relational aesthetics. And not just in terms of Nicholas Borio's coining of relational aesthetics, which Gillick also criticized. So, yeah, criticism needs objectivity. It needs a kind of pulling out of subjectivity as much as you can. But you also have to embrace subjectivity in relation to criticism and be aware of your own biases, your own relationships with institutions or other things that determine the direction of your criticism. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Recording stopped.